Feminism Concepts and Theories. We are now marching forth into lecture 8. Welcome back to week 3. As you may recall, in the last week we covered two important concepts, equality and difference. We will continue in the same mode and you will get used to the ways in which we are thinking about concepts in a gendered fashion. Equality and difference form the cornerstone of a lot of the work we are going to do henceforth, and therefore start thinking about all of these concepts together. I am going to lead you through various ways to think about a concept called choice. You have already been introduced to the question of this concept with the video we looked at last week, Empower My Choice. We spoke a little bit perhaps about liberal feminism and individuals. So today's lecture is going to build on those very concepts and complicate the idea of choice. Now, of course, as ever, our goal is not to take choice and critique it to the point where we can't use it anymore, but to be able to widen the capacity of the concept to explain life as we know it and to be able to be used for the goals of the feminist movement and feminist theory. So, in relation to choice, we ask a couple of questions in order to achieve our goal. 1. What is choice all about in relation to individual identity? Now, this is, as I mentioned, something that is very common to our understanding of everyday life. So, how do we understand it in relation to our own identities? In other words, are individuals all about making choices, and how do we understand such a capacity in a gendered fashion? 2. This is very important. Choice is predicated upon individuals very often, and therefore we ask, is there a separate self? Is there a non-continuous separate individual self that can then make choices which we are then going on to interrogate? It's an open question. We'll come back to it. Lastly, very specifically for the purpose of this course, we ask, how is it that the idea of choice is also part of certain assumptions about identity and gender? Now, as you may be used to this by now, the word assumptions is very important to our understanding about choice. We are trying to critically break it down to see how is it that certain natural sounding ideas about choice have to be deconstructed vis-a-vis gender. So, this in totality is how we are going to approach the question of choice. Let's start very much with this commonsensical understanding. In current day capitalist, what is called late modern society, choice is the one thing that everybody is expected to make. You make choices every day. You wake up, you decide what kind of toothpaste you're going to use, what clothes you're going to wear, what you're going to eat. If you have the capacity to make a choice, even within limited constraints. So often the question of choice is always positional. What you see around you, the pictures on the screen, are very much about the idea that modernity is inundated with choices. There's too much to choose from. Now, a certain commonsensical idea like this hides the understanding that it's primarily about one kind of population that such a statement is made. So, we are talking about the idea of choice as going hand in hand with the question of consumption. In such an understanding, the consumer is the primary citizen, and those who cannot be consumers automatically become exempt from what Renata Salisil calls the tyranny of choice. And the tyranny of choice is expected to be something that all of us belabor under, rich and poor alike, because even the poor are told in many ways that because they did not choose the right things is why they are poor. I will not deconstruct the problems with that statement, but this is just to say that the word choice, its connotations, its consequences surround us in the present moment. Therefore, what are the ways in which feminist theory deals with choice? Let's start then with the context of individual choice before we even move on to feminist theory. Choice is considered in the current moment as the lead up to many other moments before it, starting with the late 70s perhaps, to be a new mechanism of self-identity. In many ways, it is influenced by the age we live in, which primarily is produced as a capitalist utopia. And therefore, in a capitalist utopia, and I use it very, very sort of in close quotes, in such a utopia, choice is your only action available. It's the only way in which you exert your identity in the world, is a commonsensical understanding. According to Anthony Giddens, this is a problem of late modernity. And late modernity, coming as it does after World War II, in an age of increasing uncertainty, breakdown, and such a breakdown is of concepts, ideas, signposts, certainties, what have you, breakdown of structures, breakdown of identities, breakdown of nation states. In such an age, choice is what is produced as a hallmark of identity. It is a product of what Giddens calls a milieu of doubt. Nothing is sure anymore. And such unsurety then makes us work through anxiety to produce the only actions that we are able to produce via choice. There is a greater array of things, but we don't know how to choose anything between those things. And we all inhabit extremely diverse, extremely segmented life worlds. What does that mean? It means that older understandings of community, kin, have broken down to the detriment of our understanding of self and the world. And in the context of such a breakdown, what happens is that choice becomes a certain kind of rebellion, as if we are still exerting our right to be by choosing how to live. Now, one of the things that Giddens also says in such a milieu, as do other theorists of late modernity, is that this is a very sort of fragmented way to live. It alienates us. It doesn't allow us any kind of security, which means that choice only allays doubt for about a minute, and then we have to make other choices to be able to allay the anxieties that arise after that. Think about that for just a second before we move on to the question of what do we do with choice in feminist theory. Now, such a context of individual choice may sound familiar to you from the assumptions of liberal feminism, because here too is the understanding that feminism can achieve its goals as long as it gives women the right to choose. Therefore, a female is an individual with the capacity to choose, and that's where we locate the possibility of liberation. The question of agency becomes very important here. And this kind of binary you will encounter again and again in relation to social theory or feminist theory, this question of structure versus agency. Very simply explained, structure versus agency is the representation of two possible vantage points of understanding individuals' lives. Are our lives governed by structure? Do we have rules that we have no choice but to follow? Family, kin, state, nation, world, so on and so forth. Or do we have agency? Do we have the capacity to act unfettered by any kind of structure, which is encapsulated in the term structure versus agency. Now, as may be already obvious to you, structure versus agency is not really realistic in that sense. It's not either structure or agency. It could be one or the other, which is that either people have agency or people are slaves to structures. Instead, the truth always lies somewhere in between, and such an in-between is often an encapsulation of life as we know it. In liberal feminism, the question of agency is paramount. The question of whether a woman is able to act in any situation and has the opportunities and the freedom to act is the side on which liberal feminism weighs. Such a notion, however, is subject to a very easy critique, because as we well know, individuals make choices, but often under tremendous constraints depending on their position in society. And this can be illustrated, for example, by questions such as career choice. Yes, And in career choice, often the question is, well, you know, if women want freedom, why don't they work? Why don't they just take up a job? Which simple question elides the understanding that women are subject to multiple constraints within which they have to make this decision of whether to have a career or not. Which is why, for example, and I brought this up before, women who work are always asked the question, how do you take care of home? And the term working woman. So, instead, if we think about it as occupational fate, that might be able to capture the structure versus agency paradox much better than liberal feminism. Anderson, for example, speaks about work on career choices and the psychology of career choices in an article called Choice. Can we choose it? Let me read out a little bit from the article to be able to understand how is it that we locate it within the structure agency debate. In couching the issue of occupational behavior within a choice framework, there is an inherent assumption that all people have to do is choose a particular job or career from a whole array of different options. To operate from this assumption simplifies the issue and implies some kind of deficiency on the part of those who appear to restrict their selection to specific fields. Educational and occupational choice is a complex process that is significantly influenced by environmental variables. Consequently, the current terminology and framework of choice is inappropriate. Pause there for a second to try and understand what this means. It means that if we locate people's choices only within a choice framework, then we tend to over-determine the agency part of that framework that I referred to earlier. Therefore, people ask puzzle questions. Why is it that women always choose careers in this country, for example, in banks and schools? Because they want a 9-to-5 schedule. But why is it that they want a 9-to-5 schedule? Do we then generalize to say that women actually just don't want to work? I don't know why such a hullabaloo is made about women and careers when clearly they can't work long hours like men. Well, consider a number of environmental variables, primary among them being the realm called home. A 9-to-5 allows women to be able to juggle life-work balance. And I say this euphemistically. What I mean to say is that it allows them to continue doing the labor at home as much as work, and thereby you see an overwhelming number of women seeking that kind of stability in time so that they can plan for the work also pending at home. In the structure versus agency debate, however, it would be a mistake to say that everything is about structure. In all of these examples, to say that actually people have very little agency means that there is very little hope. A structural kind of argument is overly deterministic. It says there is only structure, there is no point fighting it, and there is no room for maneuver. And why is this a problem? Think about the ways in which we all live. Of course, commonsensically, we are all aware of constraint and structure. We are intelligent beings. But within that structure, do we not act? Do we not have joy? Do we not have hope? Do we not find ways to do more than is expected of us? In which case, how can there not be agency? However, the agency part of the debate constructs choice as the only act that matters. In other words, if you are oppressed, it's because you didn't choose the right thing. If you are unsuccessful, it's because you didn't choose the right thing. If you're miserable, it's because you chose badly. So the fallout from constructing an agency kind of debate is that you put excessive emphasis on people's ability or inability to choose, as if that is something that the individual decides without constraint. It's overly optimistic as opposed to structure, which is overly deterministic, and very importantly, it condemns those that do not choose, those that refuse to choose or make choices that do not necessarily lead to the things that are good and fair in society are considered deficient. Their structural constraints are not taken into account. Therefore, there is an endless ping pong between microscopic agency, small agency in everyday life, versus deterministic structure at the macro level. We are never quite sure where to locate our debate and our argument. Hold on to that problem for just a second. Let's start with the first model in choice that I will explicate today, which is rational choice theory. Now, rational choice theory of course comes from economics, and in many ways consider rational choice theory as the explication of the agency part of the choice debate. So, let us then expand upon this and take it to a wider conception and see what happens. In rational choice theory, we consider choice as a result of technical rationality, rationality in action and as seen through a range of actions. Rational choice, of course, takes into account a very particular conception of the individual as free, as thinking, as sentient. Yeah, and very importantly, the individual is always utility maximizing, seeks to get the best possible result from choices. We will talk a little bit about what that best possible result means, but in just a second. The individual is motivated by the rewards and costs of these actions, and therefore, in the process of such motivation, identifies possibilities, has information about each possibility, and makes an informed choice accordingly. As you can tell, this is quite an ideal circumstance. I mean, what's wrong in this picture, right? You have a set of things that people are making available to you, the world is making available to you. You have pros and cons with each. You evaluate it and say, which is the best possible life I will get from choosing A, B or C. C gives you the best life and you're sort of like, now C, right? And in the process, all of these things are given to all individuals is the understanding. You will get information, you will get capacity to access any choice that you want. The world is your oyster. Yeah? Now, this is the individual of rational choice theory. The assumptions that undergird such rational choice theory are also about society. In society, the actions of individuals explain the nature of society. They all add up to something. Therefore, complex phenomena in society can be understood through the actions of individuals. The individual is the elementary unit of social life. There is only a set of individuals, and these are the units through which society functions. And very importantly, since we are speaking about neoclassical economics, markets are regulators of human behavior. Pause for just a second and examine what that means. What do I mean when I say markets are regulators of human behavior? It's not that market is the only institution, but the imagination of a market where demand and supply are the forces that equalize society is how we imagine everything, including individual behavior, which is that certain people make certain sets of choices and the supply of something runs out, then people will automatically make other choices and society will balance itself out. This is a very sort of invisible hand idea of society itself upon which we base rational choice theory. Now, as you can imagine, there are multiple feminist critiques of this form of theory, primary among them being that every time such a rational choice theory encounters women who behave differently, they attribute it to women thinking in the service of the household as the primary unit rather than self as a primary unit. Whereas, men always make profit maximizing individual choices. Men think about themselves, women think about the home. And this is how you explain the different kind of choices that men and women make. In many ways, this is a double bind, because on the one hand, you're saying, well, it's because women are thinking about the household that they're not making the kind of choices that allows them to maximize profit. But at the same time, you're also saying that, well, women are only capable of thinking of the household, so of course they will never achieve the kind of profit maximization that men do. So there is both a critique and a structural constraint embedded in the same set of assumptions. Markets are constructed as competitive, and that's why men compete with one another in making choices, whereas the household is constructed as harmonious, and therefore women make choices to be able to preserve that peace rather than to be able to quote unquote win. In this are also embedded gendered constructions of self-interest. The moment we go back to this question of the self that makes choices between a set of rationally ordered, information replete possibilities, immediately we know that men will choose differently, women will choose differently. And I don't say this as matters of fact. I am saying this to be able to explain how rational choice theory imagines men and women. In other words, a woman making the kind of choices that a man makes is considered to be not woman-like and not having the same kind of affinity for household as men do. Such a theory then becomes inadequate to explain both things, both society and the ways in which gender operates. It does not take into account any kind of structural constraints in the ways in which gender, men, women operate in a highly gendered society. People have sought to try and change such an understanding of choice and instead put forth the possibility of what they call purposeful choice, which is not rational choice, where rationality is the quality of individuals that is either present or absent, but that people act with purpose that is in keeping with the nature of their desires. Such a reworking of rational choice theory attempts to grapple with this question of desire, which can be constructed differently depending on the kind of structures within which such desires arise, and therefore trying to avoid the dichotomy of rational men versus irrational women / others. And this is an important thing to remember, which is that we are not throwing rational choice theory out of the window. We are instead asking what are the assumptions of rational choice theory and how might we be able to mend them. From here, let's then think about the other formulation within which we can understand the agency part of the debate without falling back into the structure agency problem. And one of the ways in which people have suggested something like that might happen is through the notion of something called the post-structural choosing subject. Here, let me take you through a little paragraph on the post-structuralist choosing subject and then see what you make of it. Post-structuralist conceptions of the subject have appealed to many because they seem to offer a way through an apparent tension in notions of social construction. Now, social construction is a popular phrase because in many ways thinking about society also entails that we think about concepts as constructed. Constructed is not the same as saying true or false. It merely means that they are constructed and they can be understood as constructions or objects in the mind. How do we speak about people as constructions of the social order on the one hand and as constructing agents or actors on the other without erring on either side? Those social constructionist accounts of schooling and socialization, which accentuated the determining effects of the social structure and ideology, had been unattractive not only due to their inherent pessimism, but also for the ways in which they seem to obliterate the real thinking person who can choose to resist, change and make a difference. On the other hand, accounts which emphasized agency and change were too often voluntarist, in danger of assuming an individual able to act and think independently of the social structure and its ideologies. In this is encapsulated the problem of erring one way or the other. Therefore, we turn to the post-structuralist choosing subject, which seems to have both sets of words in it, actually 3 sets of words: structuralism, choice or choosing, and subject, which seems to be about individuals formed within the constraints of society. What are post-structural accounts? Post-structural accounts are critiques of both rationality and humanism, and suggest that the consciousness and deliberateness of rationality may be subverted by both conscious and unconscious desire, and an individual is not always rational, justified, continuous, coherent. Think then of the kind of individual that is assumed by post-structural theory. The individual has desire, the individual has the need to act as an agent. However, the nature of desire is both conscious and unconscious. In unconscious desire, we may locate the working of what is called discourse, or the idea that structures in society act upon us to create in us desires that seem to come from within us but are actually the result of socialization. An individual's choices, or what are called rational choices, can be subverted by such desires. Sometimes you act in ways that you do not want to act in, mainly because you are coveting these actions. Sometimes you act in ways that you know you should not act in, but you just feel like it. The post-structural choosing subject is one such subject. For the post-structuralist choosing subject, desire is constituted through discourses through which one is subject of and subject to. One is the subject of discourses. Discourses act upon us, which means that they act through us and we react to them and modify ourselves in relation to things we hear and see and feel in society. We are also subject to such discourses. We are bound to be limited by these discourses. Very, very important. Not all subject positions are equally available, which means individuals do not have the right to endlessly be whoever they want to be. There are limits to these that change from person to person depending on your location in life, depending on race, caste, class, gender. These are very real constraints, which means we all operate within a tight repertoire of possibilities. And to follow up, individuals have differential access to particular discursive positions. There is very, very clear differentiation between the access of one person as opposed to the other, and in many ways such kinds of differential access are what we call inequality in society. In such a society, and now we come to the punchline, one of the ways in which gender operates is that men have greater access to discourses of autonomy. Men have lesser constraint in the ways in which they are allowed to be rational choosing subjects. And of course, here I say men as a general category, but this also differs by race, caste and class. So you already know that there are inequalities shot through even the category of men, and you come one rung down the ladder between men and women, there are greater differences as enshrined in the understanding of rational men versus irrational women who are not making the right choices. In such a scenario, feminist theory says that choice is an illusion. Choice, consequence, agency are considered to be related, but when choice itself is precarious, the consequences are already given and agency is limited. Therefore, choice is the simultaneous act of free will even as one submits to the existing order. What does that mean? It means that sometimes we are doomed to make the same choices which otherwise appear as free choice. It feels like people are choosing particular things when they could have chosen something else, but given that they have constrained subject positions, they will make the same choices again and again and again. Such are the ways in which structure and agency battle one another. And therefore, as we end this session on the question of choice, Remember that choice itself is not a problem. The idea that only those who choose have the right to a good life is a problem, and this is the kind of critique that feminist theory subjects choice to. In the next session, we will take up another concept. Until then,